Since the beginning of Game of Thrones, the show felt like it could never end. In the book Present Shock, Douglas Rushkoff uses the show's opening title sequence as an allegory to this problem.
The camera pans over an animated map of the entire world of the saga, showing the various divisions and clans within the Empire. It is drawn in the style of a fantasy role-playing map, used by participants as the game board for their battles and intrigues. And like a fantasy role-playing game, the show is not about creating satisfying resolutions, but rather about keeping the adventure alive and as many threads going as possible. There is plot, there are many plots, but there is no overarching story, no end. There are so many plots, in fact, that an ending tying everything up seems inconceivable, even beside the point.
Rushkoff definitely has a point. The best word to describe the earlier seasons of the show would probably be chaotic. Main characters die at a moment's notice, and plots meander in many different directions. And that's part of the appeal of Game of Thrones. It's exciting to experience a world where the present moment is so unpredictable. But what Rushkoff fails to mention is the narrative hidden beneath the surface of all that present chaos. In reality, Game of Thrones does have a story. It is the story of characters traumatized by the past, shocked in the present, and looking for a future to believe in. Yes, the world of Game of Thrones is defined by chaos, but many characters in Game of Thrones are not. They are instead defined by their struggle to find a story within the world they exist in. There's no episode that makes this distinction better than in the season 6 finale, The Winds of Winter. The episode shows us characters trying to make sense of the world in many different ways. By putting them all together, this episode becomes a metaphor for the entire series as a whole. It is the symbolic end of the chaotic era of Game of Thrones from seasons 1 through 6, and the beginning of its attempt of finding meaning within that chaos. The episode begins with the biggest act of chaos in the show's entire run up to this point, the destruction of the Sept of Baelor. This sequence leads up to an act of terrorism orchestrated by Cersei Lannister, the character who most embodies the chaos and cynicism present in the Game of Thrones world. Up to this point, she and her family have been responsible for the show's most significant discontinuities in its linear narrative. She and her son had the show's main character killed in the 9th episode. She and her father had more main characters killed in the Red Wedding, and she herself has lost all attachment to the future. After 2 of her children died suddenly, she gave up on preserving anything other than herself and those immediately loyal to her. We can therefore see her destruction of the Sept of Baelor, along with the religious hierarchy, political rivals, and many more main characters, as the ultimate act of chaos. Not only does she destroy the literal embodiment of belief in the Seven Kingdoms, but she does it
because it felt good to watch them burn. It felt good to imagine their shock and their pain.
Cersei doesn't destroy the Sept because she has some plot for world domination. She does it because she feels she has nothing left to lose. And when someone has nothing to lose, they can risk everything to end up on top. Margaery, a character with just as much political savvy as Cersei, is the only one in the Sept who sees this.
Cersei understands the consequences of her absence, and she is absent anyway, which means she does not intend to suffer those consequences.
The other characters are so blinded in their belief in the sanctity of religious traditions that they couldn't fathom the possibility that Cersei wouldn't show up for the trial, much less retaliate with violence. Cersei's cynicism is an advantage. While others cling to their beliefs, she decides to embrace the chaos and protect herself. Her destruction of the Sept is the epitome of the chaotic world of Game of Thrones. Ironically, this act of chaos is also the beginning of a more linear ending to the show. It gets rid of multiple important characters and ends a major plotline that has dominated the show for the last 2 seasons. Thus, the show begins its shift from a chaotic and meandering character study to an ending-oriented and plot-focused TV drama. The Winds of Winter begins with the familiar chaos of Game of Thrones, but the rest of the episode shows us something unfamiliar, characters banding together, getting revenge, and realizing their destinies.
I'm to be the new Maester.
The rest of this episode focuses on wrap-up of various characters' plotlines, a further attempt at bringing an end to the chaos. Jaime's military campaign ends, Sam reaches Old Town, Melisandre is cast away, Jon and Sansa resolve their tension, and some unlikely alliances form. As we land in Meereen with Daenerys, the show points towards some finality and progress. While Daenerys has spent the entire show in Essos growing as a leader and as a character, she was always going to return to Westeros to reclaim the throne. Her conversation with Daario Naharis shows us she is finally ready to take this crucial step in her personal narrative. Daenerys' whole life story has been about her right to the Iron Throne. While Cersei desires power out of a desire for self-preservation, Daenerys fights for the throne because of a belief in destiny.
What is it you want?
My birthright, the 7 kingdoms of Westeros.
Her right to rule comes from a belief in a story about succession, but Cersei rules because she tore down those beliefs. This is why Tyrion decides to support Daenerys.
So I said no thank you to belief. And yet, here I am. I believe in you.
Tyrion, a self-proclaimed cynic, son of the most cold-hearted politician in Westeros and brother of Cersei herself, finds his faith in Daenerys. Her potential rule offers a restoration from the chaos brought by his family, and it is why she is central to this story. She hopes to restore the stories and institutions undone by civil wars and cynical lords. Back in Westeros, we get another satisfying culmination: Arya's revenge murder of Walder Frey for his betrayal of her family. This scene shows a different solution to the chaos: revenge.
The last thing you're ever going to see is a Stark smiling down at you as you die.
It's a satisfying moment in Game of Thrones because this type of justice is so rare. The idea of justice itself is a story. It requires cause and effect and the righting of a wrong. While Cersei's retribution at the start of this episode was explosive and indiscriminate, Arya's retribution is incisive and personal. Then in Winterfell, the Lord of Chaos himself, Peter Baelish, speaks with Sansa by the weirwood tree. Sansa remarks on her growth from a naive, aspiring princess to cynical wardeness of the North.
Back then I only thought about what I wanted, never about what I had.
She is the most prominent victim of chaos in the show. Her multiple traumas have created a discontinuity in her personal narrative. While she once prayed and wanted to become a princess, the horrors she has been subjected to have crushed her belief in stories and happy endings. Like Cersei and Littlefinger, this cynicism is her advantage. But even in such a hopeless character, the show manages to find her something to believe in, a way to end her trauma and finish her story. Setting this scene in the Godswood hints at that one last thing that Sansa believes in.
You, my love, are the future of House Stark.
Her family. Finally, we see the immensely consequential vision of Jon's true parentage, leading into the scene where he is declared king in the North. Though Jon is the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, heritage is not the basis of his leadership like it is for Daenerys, nor is it simply because he killed his enemies, like Cersei. While these things are a part of it, they only matter because he could unite the disparate houses under a single banner. Without this popular approval, Jon's rule would be just another chaotic plotline, but their overwhelming support shows that people will put chaos and cynicism aside to fight for a common cause, something rare for the series. Jon is able to do this because he gave the Northern Lords something beyond the present to believe in. His warnings of White Walkers and the Army of the Dead motivated them to put rivalries on hold to fight a common enemy. Jon represents an alternative to chaos and to restoring old stories. So at the end of the Winds of Winter, we have 2 opposed coronations and another would-be ruler on the way. One who represents the chaos of a world without a story, another who promises to restore an old story, and a third who offers a different story entirely. At its core, Game of Thrones has been a story about people finding ways to survive in an uncertain world, learning to trust in one another to fight for common causes, and reconstructing a new narrative in a world without any. But before this finale episode, the show was more about people finding their way through the present chaos, and after this episode, it became about pushing characters towards a future that wrapped up the past. As Thrones moved towards a world driven by story, and away from a world driven by chaos, it had to make a complete shift, no longer focusing on the exciting and watchable present chaos. Of course, the show had to end sometime, but endings are, in a way, against everything that made Game of Thrones special in the first place. Nonetheless, it's the fantasy we've all been indulging in for the last decade, because it speaks to a universal struggle. So don't be sad how the show ends, because in reality, there's no time like the present.